Tractate Sukkah discusses the laws of the holiday of Sukkot, celebrated towards the end of the Hebrew month of Tishrei. As the verse says, in Sukkahs, which means a hut of a sort, you shall dwell for a 7-day period. Every citizen of Israel shall dwell in Sukkahs, so that your children will know that I caused the children of Israel to dwell in Sukkahs when I took them out of the land of Egypt. It commemorates how the Jewish people were protected after leaving Egypt in the desert by the miraculous clouds. So we dwell in little huts, meaning we eat and drink inside of a sukkah during this period. The details of the structure of this building and what constitutes a sukkah will be discussed in this tractate. It will also cover the laws of the lulav and esrog, another important obligation of this holiday, and in the times of the temple, the water libations and other ceremonies done in the temple. Chapter 1 begins with a discussion on what exactly constitutes a sukkah. Essentially, a sukkah must have at least 3 walls and a roof made of plants called schach. If the schach roof is above 20 cubits high, it's not a valid sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda says it is. A sukkah not at least 10 handbreadths high, or one which does not have 3 walls, or the roof lets more sun through than there is shade, is also invalid. The Gemara mentions a discussion from an earlier tractate, Tractate Eruvin, where it's discussing similar dimensions by an alleyway, a mavoi, and there it mentions you can lower the walls to make it valid. It doesn't provide such a solution here, either as these laws are biblical, not rabbinic, or it's because these laws are way more complex, so instead of going on a whole explanation, it just simply said it's invalid here, even though it could have just said how to fix a too high sukkah by lowering it. It also brings and debates a number of verses as sources for these dimensional limitations of the sukkah. There's discussion as to why exactly 20 cubits is too high. Some say it's because you won't see the schach roof. Some say it's because there won't be shade. Some have the opinion that as the sukkah must be a temporary dwelling, they say underneath 20 cubits, that works, even if the walls are made of iron, as it's considered to be a temporary dwelling. Any structure above 20 cubits would be considered a permanent dwelling and therefore can't be used. Some disagree, saying the verse means it has to be literally a temporary structure, meaning no metal walls. It's not about the height level. Some say the dispute if the sukkah can be over 20 cubits is where the roof is not touching the walls, and if it did, both opinions would agree it's valid even if it's over 20 cubits. This would be like the opinion that says the issue is one of noticing the schach. As he says now, as the wall is attached, you'll actually notice the schach roof. Others say the dispute is where the sukkah is only 4 by 4 cubits wide, and if it was larger, they would agree it's valid even if it's over 20 cubits. This would be like the opinion that the issue is that there needs to be shade from the schach. Others say the argument is if the sukkah is only large enough to hold your head, most of your body, and the table. If it's larger than that, both would agree it's allowed. This is like none of the explanations listed. This is discussed further. It says an incident that the Queen Helena of Lud had a sukkah over 20 cubits tall, and it was permitted, implying the opinion of Rav Yehuda that it can be higher than 20 cubits, and even though women are exempt from the obligation of the sukkah, she had 7 sons, so one at least was old enough that he needed to stay in the sukkah, even if only rabbinically, which she abided by. Now, based off this incident, this would seem to imply like the opinion that the issue is one of not being able to notice the schach, as the roof not being attached makes sense by a queen, and this incident implies, unlike the other opinions, who say the issue is when the sukkah is too small, because there's no way a queen is staying in a tiny little sukkah. They would answer no. The sukkah in question was unique in that it was a large sukkah, but it had little cubicles inside. And the dispute is if it's permissible even when one of the sons is inside a smaller mini sukkah cubicle. Anyways, some say the law is that the sukkah must be large enough to hold your head, most of your body, and a table. This is debated from a number of sources, for instance, if it needs to be large enough to actually hold the table. There are related points as to how the sukkah can be uniquely small, less than 4 by 4 cubits, but a house is not considered to be a dwelling if it's that small. This has relevancy by the laws of mezuzah, the necessity to put a protective fence around your roof, and others, as those are referenced in the Torah as being applicable to a house, and something smaller than 4 by 4 cubits is too small to be considered a house in that sense. This has additional relevance in the establishment of an eruv and by some laws of property ownership. If the sukkah is over 20 cubits tall and you want to lower it to make it a permissible height by filling the interior with cushions, that's still not valid, as most people in the world would not nullify their cushions in such a manner. You can, however, do so with straw or dirt, as those can have their ownership abandoned in this sense. That's if you're explicitly abandoning the straw or dirt. If you just leave it there and happen to not plan on using it for anything else, it's debated if this works, based on a source. Also, if the sukkah is exactly the minimum height, 10 handbreadths tall, and the leaves of the schach plant roof hang lower than the amount, some say it's valid if there's still more shade than sunlight. Others disagree, as it's an uncomfortable dwelling place and not a place you would normally dwell in. Also, if the sukkah is too high, you can have an elevated wall put on one of the sides that has its measurements be small enough that it's permissible for it to be valid. You can even put it to the side like this, if there's under a 4-cubit gap between it and its opposite wall. This is relevant as this third wall here is not valid, but the principle of a bent wall applies, that if the schach doesn't quite reach the wall, it's fine if the gap is under 4 cubits. Similarly, if you build a platform right in the middle of a too high sukkah, it's still valid if there's less than 4 cubits from the platform to the walls due to the same principle, which can also apply in every direction at once. Also, if the sukkah is too low, under 10 handbreadths, and you dig a pit in the sukkah to make it a permissible height, it's valid if there's less than 3 handbreadths from the edge of the pit to the walls. This is different than the other case where they needed only a 4-cubit distance, as those have legal walls that are just too high. Here, we require a stricter measurement. Another unique case, if the sukkah is too high and there's a 10 handbreadth tall pillar inside, some say you should extend the partitions of the pillar to the schach above, making a sukkah on top of the pillar. Others say that those walls are just not noticeable enough to be valid. Also, if you put poles on the edge of your house and then schach on top, it's debated if this is valid, even though there's no walls, if the walls of the roof are considered to extend upwards or not. This and similar points are debated. There are also verses cited as to the source for the minimum heights of a sukkah. These are discussed along with points on the dimensions of the ark and the positioning of the wording of the tzitz. The verses and sources in regard to the dimensions of the ark are further debated. This goes further along with points on interpositions by the laws of ritual impurity. Anyways, we also said a sukkah must have 3 walls. Some say this can be 2 walls, and a tiny third one, even a handbreadth long, while others say it must have 3 walls and then even a tiny fourth one. This is debated based on interpretation of some verses. There's also many suggestions as to where exactly this extra small wall is going, if it's the third. Some say next to either wall, some say it should be diagonal, some say in between where one of the walls should be, some say diagonal in the opposite corner, some say it must be like a door frame with a beam across, which also has some variation. This is compared to some points on Shabbos domains. This goes further. In regards to the prohibition against a majority sunlight, some say this only applies to sunlight coming through the roof, while others say it also includes sunlight coming through the walls, which is debated based on verses. There are a few other miscellaneous points on forbidden sukkahs, like it can't be cone-shaped, or it can't be that the roof is leaning diagonal against the house's wall, and some say a round sukkah is impermissible as it needs corners. Others disagree and say it's allowed if its circumference is large enough to seat 24 people. The dimensions of such a circular sukkah are qualified. There are several other miscellaneous types of sukkahs that are discussed in regards to their permissibility, like certain types of huts used during the rest of the year now being used as a sukkah. New Mishnah. Beis Shammai says you cannot use an old sukkah. Beis Hillel says you can. An old sukkah is one built over 30 days before the holiday of Sukkot. However, if it was built specifically for sukkahs, it's valid if it was built whenever throughout the year. The Gemara says the verses which source these opinions and some related points. New Mishnah. If the sukkah is built beneath a tree, it is as if it was built inside a house and is invalid. A sukkah built on top of the sukkah, where only the top one is valid. Rabbi Yehuda says that if no one is staying on the top one, the lower one is also valid. The Gemara says an opinion that the prohibition against building the sukkah beneath the tree is if the tree provides more shade than sunlight, hence the comparison to being built inside a house. The issue is if the tree branches are mixed with the schach roof. There are related points. It cites the sources for not staying in a stacked sukkah, and discusses a few possible cases where both sukkahs are valid, where the lower sukkah has more sunlight than shade, the upper one has more shade than sunlight, and the upper roof is within 20 cubits. Both could be invalid if both have more shade than sunlight and the upper roof is above 20 cubits. It could be that just the lower one is valid if its shade is greater than its sunlight and the upper one's roof sunlight is greater than its shade and both are within 20 cubits. Just the upper one could be valid if both have shade greater than sunlight and they're within 20 cubits. This was all brought just for the case where only the lower one is valid and there's no issue of thinking that if the upper one is above 20 cubits, the two roofs can combine shade for the lower one. There are a few opinions as to how large the gap between the sukkah roofs must be to invalidate the lower ones. Some say a handbreadth based on a comparison to laws of impurity. Some say 4 handbreadths, as that's considered a significant area minimum. Others say 10 handbreadths, as that's the minimum amount to validate a sukkah. The other points are debated, such as what not fit for residence means. Some say it's an issue of height. Some say it has to be able to support pillows and cushions. It's discussed. New Mishnah. If you spread a sheet above or beneath a sukkah to prevent sun or leaves, or a sheet over a 4-poster bed in a sukkah, it's invalid. You can spread a sheet over a 2-poster bed. The Gemara says some allow the sheet underneath the schach if it's for decoration, not just as a general blanket rule. And it mentioned falling leaves as a common case. There are proofs from sources brought. Some add that decorations do not adjust the height of the sukkah, but some say they do adjust the width. These points are all further qualified. There's also points about sleeping beneath a canopy. For instance, you can't say the Shema prayer while fully undressed, but if you're sleeping beneath a specific certain described type of canopy bed, you can stick your head out and say the Shema if the canopy is under 10 handbreadths and it's not considered a tent. This is discussed. The points on the permissibility of sleeping beneath certain types of canopies in a sukkah are qualified. New Mishnah, if you have vines or ivy or similar growing out of the ground and lay them atop your sukkah and then put the schach roof on top, it's invalid unless there's more schach than vine, or if you detach the vines from the ground. Anything susceptible to impurity or something that doesn't grow from the ground cannot be used as schach. Otherwise, it can. The Gemara says in opinion that if you sever the vines from the ground, you still need to pick them up and put them back down. This is debated along with comparison to a similar concept by tzitzit strings, where they were made in an impermissible manner, but are being cut in a manner that turns them into permissible tzitzits. These points are discussed along with sources for these parameters. There are further sources mentioned. New Mishnah. Bundles of straw, wood, or cane cannot be used as schach, so long as they're bundled, but they can be used when they're untied. Any of the items which we've said were impermissible as the schach roof can be used as the walls. The Gemara says the source for these points, and they're discussed. There are particularities in regards to things which are susceptible for impurity being used as schach. For instance, there's variation by certain types of arrow shafts being used as schach, depending on if the shaft is connected to the arrowhead. If the shaft goes into the arrowhead, it'd be allowed. If it's hollow and the arrowhead has a part which goes into the hollowed shaft, it would not be allowed based on laws of impurity in regards to receptacles. Further, in regards to impurity, you can use unprocessed flax, not combed flax, and they're unsure if you can use partially processed flax. There are also certain herbs listed that you can use. There are other points in various forms of vegetation. It also defines a bundle. One thing bound is not a bundle. 3 things bundled are considered a bundle. The sources are also discussed. There are certain types of bundles which are permissible to be used as schach. Bundles from surah can be used, as those are only bundled to be sold in set amounts. Cone-shaped huts made of tied willow branches can be used if their knots are undone, but the braiding of the branches is still in place. Or possibly it's just the upper knots that were undone, but it's not considered to be a bundle as it's not made to be carried. There are other types of produce discussed as to whether you can use them as schach. There are other points also in regards to laws of impurity, and these are discussed further. New Mishnah. There's a debate if you can cover the sukkah with boards as schach. If there's a board 4 handbreadths wide on the sukkah, it's still valid as long as you don't sleep right beneath it. The Gemara says the debate by boards is either where they're over 4 handbreadths, and the issue is whether they're allowed as they resemble a roof. Others say they're smaller than that, and they would both hold that if they're larger than 4 handbreadths, they're invalid, and also if they're under 3 handbreadths, they'd be valid, as they're just considered to be sticks then. The argument would be if they're between 3 and 4 handbreadths, based off if you hold this is considered to be a significant amount. We try to bring proofs from cases as to who is correct. There are several unique cases discussed to try and figure out what we hold, like a case where there are several boards laying across, a case where they're turned vertical, which is debated if this is allowed, and further. New Mishnah. If there's a roof over your sukkah structure already made of boards, if they're not plastered, one opinion says Beis Shammai would hold that you have to loosen the boards and also remove a board between every 2, while Beis Hillel would say you could just loosen them or remove a board between every 2. Others say you just need to take out the boards with no loosening being necessary. The Gemara debates the sources and these opinions. New Mishnah. If your sukkah's roof is made of an invalid schach, like a spit or bedsides, if the gaps between them is as wide as the item itself, and the gaps are filled with schach, it's valid. If you hollowed out a haystack to make a sukkah, that's not valid. The Gemara discusses these opinions and some contradicting ones, saying our case is where the gaps are wide enough that you could easily put one of the items in between. Or they're actually the same size, and the valid schach is being laid across them perpendicularly. It also discusses bedsides, which aren't susceptible to impurity and are still impermissible, which would possibly mean worn clothes are also impermissible, but we say the bed actually is considered a utensil, as it has a long side with 2 legs or a short side with 2 legs. How this exactly makes it a utensil and susceptible to impurity is explained from those points. It also discusses how worn clothes are impermissible to cover your sukkah with, and what constitutes worn clothes, saying patches less than 3 by 3 finger breadths. There are similar points. In regards to hollowing out a haystack as a sukkah, some would allow it if there was a cavity within a handbreadth high and 7 long that you widened, and proofs are brought. New Mishnah. If the walls of the sukkah are built from the top down, if the wall winds up being 3 handbreadths above the ground, it's invalid. By the inverse, if there's a gap between the wall and the schach when you built it from the bottom up, it's valid so long as the wall is above the minimum height. Others disagree, saying it's permitted even if there's a gap by the bottom. The Gemara says this latter opinion holds this, as he says a suspended partition is a valid partition. This is also discussed by the laws of Eruvin by page 86a of Tractate Eruvin in regards to a cistern between two courtyards, where exactly the partition needs to be within to act as a divider. This is further discussed. Some say a mat that is a bit over 4 handbreadths is valid as a sukkah wall, as you could suspend it midway between the ground and the roof with only less than 3 handbreadth gaps between them. This is said to show that the principle of lovehood, that small gaps in walls being under 3 handbreadths are legally considered to be sealed off, and this could apply twice on a wall. This wouldn't work by a large sukkah, as you'd need a mat a bit over 7 handbreadths. There are further related points. New Mishnah. If the schach is 3 handbreadths away from one of the walls, it's invalid. If there was a hole knocked into the middle of your roof and you put schach inside, it's invalid if there's a gap of over 4 cubits between the walls and the schach. This also applies by a courtyard with a bunch of porches sticking into it that you put schach over. Also, if there's a large sukkah where the roof just has a surrounding square of stuff that can't be used as schach, with a schach in the middle, 4 cubits away from the roof, it's invalid. The Gemara says that it gave all of these different examples, as if it was just the breached house, you might have thought that it was unique as the walls were built for the house, so they could be considered connected, unlike by the porch case. So we need both of these, and we need the third case is there, the surrounding area is invalid as schach, so we bring it to establish that it's not unique and the above rules still apply. There's debate as to how wide an open space or strip of invalid material needs to be to invalidate the sukkah. Some say an open space needs to be 3 handbreadths and a forbidden material needs to be 4, which is debated based on their logics. Some say those different types of forbidden strips don't combine as they have different measurements. This point is debated. It also argues over the source of these opinions. Further proofs are brought and disproven. It also says if there's a gap in your schach 3 handbreadths wide, it can be reduced with sticks or even spits, which are typically invalid. You cannot use spits by a small sukkah. This point is debated, and in regards to the laws of impurity and some related points. If the schach is placed across porches that have poles at their ends, they're valid. If they don't, it's debated. Possibly yes, as you could say the edge of the roof is considered to stretch downwards, but we say not here as it's considered to be an open alleyway anyways, which is invalid. This is further discussed. These points are further debated with several unique cases brought. New Mishnah. Some say a sukkah shaped like a cone or leaning against the wall is invalid as it has no roof. Others say it is valid. The Gemara says, if the sukkah leaning against a wall is either a handbreadth off the ground or away from the wall, it's valid. The opinion that says it's valid either way is as they hold that sloped roofs are considered to be legally roofs. This is discussed citing some cases. New Mishnah. A large reed mat, if used for reclining, is susceptible to impurity and cannot be used to cover a sukkah. If it was made for covering a sukkah, it's not susceptible to impurity and can be used as schach. Others say this also applies to small reed mats. The Gemara discusses qualifications on these opinions. This is discussed further, along with some additional laws on impurity. These are further discussed along with the uses of different types of mats, and an opinion that you can use a mat that doesn't have a rim, which we have some sources for. And that's the end of chapter 1.